Welcome back to this teaching on church planting called Kingdom Invasion. My name is Steve Hyde, and I'm a missionary in Cambodia and have been working in church planting for more than 30 years now. I'd like to share with you today about church models which multiply well and church models which do not multiply well. So the title of the lesson today is Church Models and Reproducibility. And so we want to talk about when we consider the fact that the world is growing in such a rapid pace, we want to develop models or use models which multiply well if our concern is really to see the whole world come to Christ and be engaged in bodies of believers that can continue to multiply and replicate the church throughout the world. I believe that's most of our goals, and that's what Christ has called us to in the Great Commission that he laid out on many occasions in the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and twice in Acts. So we can see these, we know that God's call on our life is to evangelize and share. So I'd like to just share from my experience and my studies about models of the church which multiply well. So this is chapter 5 in the book Kingdom Invasion. The book Kingdom Invasion, which I wrote after many years of serving in church planting to help train people like yourselves to be more effective in church planting. So the first model that I'd like to highlight is home groups or house churches. And especially in the last 30 years or so, the home groups or house church model has continued to become more and more prevalent and more common as people see that it reproduces quite well. And so I'd like to share with you some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages of a house church. Okay, so the first advantage I'd like to share is that a house church can start anywhere, any place, because dedicated facilities are not needed. And so because you're just utilizing people's homes to meet and worship in people's homes, people have homes everywhere. So everyone has a home pretty much, and so you can utilize those homes which were readily available. Another advantage is it's not formal, and so it's easier to build relationships. Sometimes in a large institutional setting, it's more complicated to build relationships, whereas if you're sitting in somebody's house together, it's much easier to develop relationships because it's not formal. Third advantage, and this is highlighted throughout the world as Christianity becomes less and less popular and becomes more and more a target of persecution. Home churches or house churches are usually not a target for persecution. When churches are attacked by other religions or from political entities, often they attack church buildings first, or they burn down church buildings, or they pronounce legal policies to close down houses of worship or church buildings. They often close down. But how do you shut down a home? And it's not as common for a house church to be a target of persecution. Okay, and then the fourth advantage is they are low cost for maintenance, low cost for upkeep, because it's somebody's home. They obviously keep up their home by themselves, and obviously we can help them when we have some functions in their home, but a house church is low cost for maintenance. Okay, there are some disadvantages as well. So let me tell you some of the disadvantages that I've observed over the years. Because while some people say the house church model is the greatest model on the earth, there are disadvantages to the model as well. Okay, so one of the disadvantages is that in many urban settings and some contexts, it's hard to have formal ceremonies. You know, in many cultures and many denominations and many countries, it's acceptable and it's important to have weddings and funerals inside churches. Well, if you're meeting in a home, the effect or the cultural benefit of having a ceremony in a so-called sanctified location is diluted significantly by using a home. And in many contexts, it's very difficult. And so we can see here that it's hard to have weddings and funerals in cultures that require those things to be done in churches. It's hard to do that in a house church context. And so often some of the symbolism and imagery is lost by using rented facilities or even borrowing somebody else's church for that. Okay, another disadvantage is that sometimes the homeowner dominates the group, and that can be a significant challenge. We know that in the New Testament, many of the churches in the New Testament actually met in homes. And so we see that letters were written to the church, which we have as books of the Bible today, were written to in certain places, and clearly was written to the owner of the house, who may or not have been the key leader of the group, but because they were the owner of the house where the church met, they had certain clout, or they had certain responsibilities that they normally wouldn't have. But it depends on what kind of person the homeowner is. And so choosing the right home can be a significant issue as well. Okay, so that's the first model, about models which multiply well, home groups or house churches. The second model which I'd like to talk about is also something which has come up and become quite popular, especially in the urban setting since the 1970s. And that is something called cell groups. Of course, the church, David Yonggi Cho's church in the Uido Full Gospel Church, is the one that really pioneered cell groups, and so built a systematic system of discipling and a network of house churches, or of cell groups, that are linked to a main church, but then they have links through the entire city, large city, and so his church was able to grow there to hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even as many as 1 million people in that church there, because of the 50,000 or so cell groups which were attached to that church. So there's some advantages to cell groups, which I'd like to explain with you. The advantages include it allows for large churches to have reasonable discipleship. In a large church setting, say you have 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, it's extremely difficult to have any discipleship beyond the Sunday morning message. And so you really don't have effective discipleship if you don't have a smaller group network. And so the cell group system allows for large churches to have reasonable discipleship. It also, a second advantage is it brings better relationships into an urban setting. So relationships are often a challenge in urban settings because your immediate neighbors are not your relatives, they're not friends that you grew up with or you've spent your entire life with. And so having a cell group system where you meet in a smaller group of 10 or 20 people in people's homes, while separate from the Sunday service, allows for you to have relationships with a smaller number of people and meaningful relationships. Okay, it also allows for relationship-based evangelism. If you invite a person into a crowd of 100,000 people or 10,000 people or 1,000 people, often they feel lost. If you invite a person into a cell group of 5, 10, 15, or 20 people, they can quickly feel at home and develop the same relationships that you have also. And so it allows for relationship-based evangelism, especially in large urban situations. Additionally, it utilizes more believers and especially women in the ministry. That's the one aspect of the Yoido Full Gospel Church in Seoul, South Korea, when they started the cell group system. David Yonggi Cho, he insisted on the leaders of the house groups being women. And in their society, many of the men were constantly working and are almost workaholics, as we would look at them from the outside. And so the men are constantly working, and the women have more time. And so the women held the role of deacons, and the women operated, and still to this day, I believe, continue to operate the 50,000 or so cell groups of that church. And so he specifically insisted on using women in that position because women had more time in their society to be at home more, and they are also the ones that are heavily involved in the discipleship aspects of the church. And so those are 4 advantages which you have to cell groups. The disadvantages of cell groups, there are also some disadvantages of cell groups as well. So just to see in the world where cell groups have grown significantly, they often have grown significantly in cultures which, as we observe from the outside, seem to be hyper-controlling or very structured societies. And so it seems like the disadvantages to a cell group is that it seems to require significant control and weekly commitment. And this can be a challenge in many societies. Also, a disadvantage of this model is that it seems to be almost exclusively an urban model. It does not work well in rural areas, but seems to work quite well doesn't work well in rural context, but works well in urban context. Okay, so those are and there's many different varieties of cell groups. There's things called the G12. There's, of course, I mentioned Yonggi Cho's model. There's some models from Nigeria which seem to have grown rapidly. Singapore also has some significant models of the church in Singapore that have significant growth from cell group models. And so the cell group model is a way that allows churches to multiply and to evangelize and discipleship significantly faster than other models. So that's another good model. Okay, another model I'd like to share with you, I just simply call the small village church. And in most communities across the world, I believe even in America, the average size of church in America is only 75 people. And if you consider churches, for example, in the country that I'm in now in Cambodia, we have as many as 10,000 churches. The average size is only 20 to 25 people in the average size church in Cambodia. And I know there's countries like Ethiopia that tend to have larger village churches, especially in populations that are majority Christian. And so even in a small village, they could have a significant number of Christians in a local church. But many of our churches that I've experienced across the world, in the Philippines and other parts in Southeast Asia and Africa, what I've observed that many of these small village churches are actually quite easy to replicate. But the small village church is a common model, and probably the most common model in the world that we have today. And so I'd like to share with you some of the advantages. One of the advantages is that in most countries, the majority of the population is rural. And so they live in rural settings, in small villages, and so it allows a sense of community to have that church, to have a small village church in small villages. Okay, additional advantages, it allows churches and community to maintain close relationships with each other. Okay, and another advantage is the programs and meetings of a small village church can be flexible, and especially in rural areas, can be flexible according to agricultural schedules that come up with harvesting and planting, and they can easily change the service times. They can change the length of the service. They can cancel or they can add services according to whatever they need, and they tend to be extremely flexible. There are some disadvantages to small village churches, and let me share with you one of the kind of an emotional disadvantage of a small village church. Sometimes people that have grown up their whole life in a small village church tend to think of themselves as being quite isolated. And because they feel quite isolated, they because they've never had a chance to be in a large group. And so there's something about being in a large group of Christians that makes you feel a part of something really amazing. And it helps us to even see God in a different way. Not that there's anything bad with small groups, but I'm just saying that there seems to be an emotional disadvantage to only being a part of a small village church and not about something bigger. Another disadvantage is often small village churches have limited access to training. As I mentioned earlier, almost all of the theological training institutions around the world are located where? In urban centers. Very, very few resources, very, very few training opportunities are available for rural leaders. And so that has a significant effect on the strength and health of small village churches as well. Another disadvantage is that often these churches lack quality resources and materials. Because where are all the bookstores located? Where are all the resources located? Most of the resources are significantly located in urban areas and not in rural areas. And so it's a difficult challenge for churches to be able to get the resources that they require, especially quality resources, training, and connection with larger ministries or different things. Even purchasing Bibles can be a significant challenge for rural churches because they don't have access to it, whereas in the cities they do. The fourth model which I'd like to share is what I call a church with a decentralized leadership structure. And so I'd like to mention to you the advantages and the disadvantages. So one of the advantages of a decentralized leadership model is that a decentralized leadership model is actually the biblical model of eldership. Eldership is always in the plural, not in singularity. And so the model for the leadership of the church is not one person who's in charge of everything, but a group of elders in plurality, multiple elders who are in charge. So it really is a decentralized system. Additionally, the leadership is not dependent on one individual personality. How many times have we seen significant churches rise and then fail because of the personality of one person who fails morally or spiritually, and because that one person fails and it was a centralized, not decentralized leadership structure, the entire church and ministry falls apart. Secondly, it allows for better equipping and discipleship. It's actually the model of discipleship that works better to have a decentralized structure. Additionally, it allows for a stronger leadership base, a base which is not just dependent on one, but it can be a base that's dependent on multiple people. It also gives respect, responsibility, and value to other people. And I'd like to share with you some of the disadvantages. There are disadvantages to a decentralized leadership model as well. First of all, if you're a leader like myself and you have a decentralized leadership model, it often requires much more time to make decisions, and that can be a challenge. It's so much easier for somebody in a leadership position like myself to not have to go through an eldership or decentralized leadership structure to get their opinions and feedback before you make a decision. It's much, much easier just to simply make a decision. But of course, by the model that Jesus has given to us of a decentralized leadership structure, allows us to have more input and make better decisions, and for us to ascertain the will of God through other people, not just from what we think it is. And so it does take more time to make decisions in a decentralized leadership structure. It also, a disadvantage is required good personal relationships. And so we know that relationships are always a struggle in our life. They're something that we always need to work towards, we always need to develop. And so if you don't have a good relationship with the others in your decentralized leadership structure, it can create tensions and create a lot of difficulties in the structure as well. So those four models are four models which multiply quite well. One is a decentralized leadership model, and the others a house church house church movement, small village churches, and cell group structures are structures of the church which multiply quite well and can multiply rapidly. Okay, and so I want to now highlight some models for you which do not multiply well. Okay, and the first one I'm just going to simply call the institutional model, the institutional church. The institutional church has some advantages, but also some significant disadvantages. And the institutional model does not grow well, does not multiply well. And I'm going to highlight to you why in just a second. Okay, so usually these institutional churches are high-profile churches. They could be in the center of the city. They could have a significant number of politicians that are involved in that, or key members of the society. And so that's an advantage, to have key people and important people in the society engaged in the church. They often attract wealthy people, and especially politicians, to an institutional church. Often they are state recognized, and so therefore an institutional church may not attract persecution like other more fringe groups or non-institutional models. They may not attract persecution like others. What are some of the disadvantages of an institutional model of church? Well, the biggest disadvantage is they are very, very expensive. They are very expensive models, and so it requires a large amount of money to be able to grow the church. But also, if you don't have that money, you don't see the growth coming in. So it's very dependent on structures, buildings, programs, and being able to afford those. Additionally, it requires professional clergy to function. And we see throughout the world, actually, we see a huge lack of professional clergy. And what I mean by professional clergy is not a leader like we understand today, as simply has studied the Bible well, has a deep relationship with the Lord, and is serving in the church. Institutional churches require denominational or institutional certification from approved and accredited theological institutions which they approve of. And so, for example, if you're in the Presbyterian Church, you need to go through a certain certification process to become a leader and to become a professional clergy inside their system. If you're in the Baptist Church, you go through a Baptist system. If you're in the Methodist Church, you go through a Methodist system. If you're in the Anglican Church, you go through an Anglican system. And you see across the world that most of these denominations are finding it extremely challenging to be able to certify and train enough qualified professional clergy to be able to hold those positions to oversee those churches. So that is a disadvantage, is because the model is dependent on professional clergy. And then sadly, many of these large churches, institutional churches, some of them have been around for hundreds of years, simply have no more people, and they're just a building. And many are even turned into museums, and sadly we can even see in many places where they're turned into restaurants and shopping places and different things like that. And so the institutional model, while certainly lives can be changed in those locations, it is not a model of church which you should try and replicate and think that you're going to be able to replicate that in a rapid way to multiply church planting in your areas. Institutional models of churches just do not multiply well. The second model I'd like to share with you is similar in line to that, but it's what I would refer to as building-based models of churches. It seems like so many people around the world, and no matter what country I went to, when they come to Christ, when they view the church, they know that the church is people, but they have this desire to have a building. And when they have this desire to have the building, sometimes it seems like the desire for the building is far greater than the desire for winning people to Christ. And I've heard people say that if you just build a building, the people will have a place to worship the Lord, and the church will grow significantly. I have really failed to see that in any significant way across the world. Obviously, there are some exceptions, but I have never seen in my personal experience where I built a building for churches, for groups of believers that were growing and needed some assistance. And so when we provided them a building, I never have seen them continue to grow and to continue to grow as a church and then continue to spread out in a missionary or evangelistic way to reach other people. But I often find that they have to use most of their resources to build more churches. So let's quickly go to some of the advantages. There are advantages to building-based churches. First of all, it gives people a sense that they are a part of a formal religion. Sometimes in house churches, people don't really feel like they're a part of something. But if there's a building with a name on it and a cross on it, people think that they're a part of something formal. Additionally, in many cultures, it allows for an easy place and a significant place to have weddings and funerals and other cultural events which are required in their cultures. Not all cultures are required to have weddings and funerals inside of churches, but for cultures that is something significant in their culture, to have a building is important. Okay, it also provides a dedicated place for worship and for training, which is very helpful. In fact, as I travel around the world and doing training, even if I'm training people to do house churches, we often either borrow or we rent churches from other buildings or institutional churches. We borrow them or rent them for the purpose of our training in training people in house churches. So there is something to having a dedicated space, but obviously many of these spaces are not utilized that well as well. So what are the disadvantages? Building-based churches are expensive. They are expensive. In developing countries, they may not be well maintained. And actually that may apply to developed countries as well. Because they are expensive, people have to dedicate their resources to be able to maintain the buildings themselves. Okay, additionally, buildings can become targets for persecution in many countries. I believe it was 1997 and 1998 when there were riots in Indonesia by one group of people that was rioting against Christians throughout the nation. And in a period of less than 1 year, 10,000 church buildings were burned down. 10,000 church buildings. And so think of the amount of resources that had to go into rebuilding those churches once they were burned down, and the people wanted to have their church buildings back, and so they pumped more resources into building them back. And that are God's resources that could have been used for other things. Additionally, they're not flexible to growth. I've often seen that once you put walls on a building, the building quits growing. And partly it's a physical limitation that it's very expensive when you put up a wall to be able to move the wall or expand the roof or expand the walls. And so buildings are not conducive to flexible growth. Additionally, abandoned church buildings and churches are really an embarrassment for us as the body of Christ. Even in Cambodia, which at one point it was reported that we had the second or third fastest growing church in all of Asia, which is quite amazingly. And yet I could take you around Cambodia from village to village, from province to province around this country, and I could show you in some villages 1, 2, or even 3 abandoned church buildings, which were built for local Christians, but then something happened, maybe jealousy, maybe they didn't really have a genuine faith in Christ, and you can go there after 5 or 10 years only, and you see that we have plenty of abandoned church buildings in this country, which is known for its rapid growth of the church. So that's something to consider also. Abandoned church buildings are an embarrassment to us as well. But also from a practical standpoint, I'd like you to consider this as well. It's so expensive to build. It's so expensive to build. So, for example, I just picked a few countries here that I'm familiar with myself. But if you wanted to reach. I believe our desire as church planters is to see countries and see regions come to Christ in a significant way. Otherwise, we wouldn't be investing our time and our lives in these things. And so, for example, if you had a great revival and you saw millions and millions of people coming to Christ, if your model was based on buildings, what would be the financial impact of that kind of growth? And would you be able to sustain it? So if you just think of a simple bamboo structure, maybe the land is dedicated or given by somebody else or donated. And if you just say most churches, even in a developing world, can easily cost 20 to 50 to even 100,000 US dollars. And so they are quite expensive. But if you just consider the basics of basics, you put up some wood yourself, all the labor is on yourself, maybe you just have a tin roof or something like that, and if we estimate only the bare basic cost of a building as only $5,000. If the entire population of the Philippines, for example, came to Christ, which is now over 100 million people, you would be required to have, according to the average size of church in the Philippines, you would be required to have $4.75 billion to be able to build enough churches to meet the growth of the church in that country if you had people all over the nation come to Christ. And that is the cheapest of cheap. And quite literally, it would be in the trillions of dollars to be able to afford the numbers of buildings that would be required to have churches across the nation. Now, Cambodia is a quite small country, but if we saw even a greater revival come across Cambodia, and I want to tell you, there are pretty much no church buildings in Cambodia that cost $5,000. I would say most of them are 50 to 100, if not $1 million. We have plenty of church buildings that have been funded by foreign funds in Cambodia that are in excess of $1 million as well. But I'd like to share with you, according to the current size of the church, even if you said the church was double in size what the average size is today, it would require almost $1 billion to build enough churches for Cambodia so that people could meet together and worship in a local church. It would cost almost $1 billion. Indonesia would cost $12 billion in church buildings. And that's if you had, remember, like I said, the basic cost of a church building, $12 billion. China would require almost $70 billion. $70 billion. The enormous cost is something to really consider about that. And if we think about it, in America, it's been reported that for every $1 spent on missions, $5 is used to pay the interest on the mortgages of church buildings in America. And I've said before in previous lessons that it's reported that over $1 trillion is loans to build churches in America. So churches have mortgages in America in excess of $1 trillion that they're having to pay on. And so it's been seen that for every $1 spent on missions, $5 is used to be spent on building projects. Is that the kind of model that we want to promote? Okay, like you go to another model here quickly as well that does not multiply well. Single leader churches or controlling leaders do not multiply well. The advantages to a single leader is it's easy to make decisions. If he's a good leader, the church could be quite well too. It could do very well. But also, practically speaking, a person cannot have a significant relationship with thousands and thousands of people. No matter how much I love to be around other people, I love to interact with other people, it's actually physically impossible for us. It's emotionally impossible for us to have relationships with hundreds and hundreds of people. And so, even though I have thousands of friends on Facebook, what is my real relationship with people? And psychologists have said that most people can only have about 70 functioning relationships at any given time. We can only relate to about 70 people at a time. And so single leader churches are limited in the number of relationships that people can have. Disadvantages to a single controlling leader would be that the church often fails when the leader fails. And we see this in the news constantly as churches grow and then the leader fails morally or fails in another way, financially, and because of that, the entire church then fails. Leaders often get burned out. When you do things alone, you often get burned out. And they're often limited to one generation. And sadly, where you see single controlling leaders, you find churches that are usually not very evangelistic, and so they simply don't grow. I'd like to share with you another model that doesn't work well, which is actually a model that I call the Amway model, or multi-level marketing model. And it's a model which sounds right, but just doesn't work right. And the model goes something like this. If you would just get everyone in your church to evangelize one person in a year, over that year, your church would double in size. Well, then the next year, your church, if you got everyone to evangelize and bring one person to the church in that year, well, then your church would not just double in size. It would double in size from that year, but it would literally be 4 times bigger. And then it would be 16 times bigger, then 32. It continued to grow exponentially. And so within a short period of time, the number of churches, the number of Christians can grow very, very rapidly. So it kind of goes like this. So if you start in year 1, and you say, okay, we're going to have a model for planting churches that follows a pyramid scheme or a multi-level marketing or what I call the Amway churches. And so in year 1, you have 1 church. Well, the second year, you'd have 2. The third year, you'd have 4. And then the fourth, and then on to the 5th year, you'd have 16. By year 7, you'd have 64 churches. Sounds exciting, but then from there, it really explodes. From year 9, you have 256 churches. From year 11, it goes all the way to 1,024 churches. Year 13, 4,096 churches, just in 13 years. Imagine if we had used a Amway model for evangelism and church planting. We would have reached the world long, long ago. The problem with it is, it doesn't really work. I remember actually a church in the Philippines that I won't mention, but they decided to use this model. They were going to encourage their church of 50 believers that they wanted to become a mega church, and they wanted to become 5,000 people in their church. And so they decided that they would focus on this model of bringing one person to Christ in 1 year, and then after a period of only 10 years, they were going to easily grow. Even if not everyone was successful, they were easily going to grow to 5,000 people. Sadly, after 20 years of watching them follow this model, you know what I observed? The church never got anywhere near to 5,000 people. In the beginning, it started out as only 75 people. And you know what the size was after 20 years? Roughly the same. It really didn't grow. And so they put this idea into this methodology of somehow you're going to get rich quick, you're going to grow disciples quick, you're going to grow churches rapidly and quickly, you can raise money to change the world, and sadly the model simply doesn't work. The model simply doesn't work. And so because of that, this is not a good model to use. Let me just quickly say the advantages. It sounds really, really good. It sounds really good. It's good for everyone on the top. You know how this pyramid scheme works. So with the pyramid scheme, the guys on the top get benefits from all these people below. And so the guys on the top eventually just become motivational speakers, and everyone on the bottom is working, and they get a cut of everything, and so they get benefit for that. Well, in the church, what do you get a cut of? If it's for the glory of God, there's no cut of anything. But it works really good for the top people, but it doesn't work very well for the people on the bottom. Also, it requires very outgoing people. How many people actually share the gospel? I've heard the Billy Graham Association say that 99% of Christians in their life will never, ever share the gospel. 99% of Christians. So the Amway model assumes that you can switch that around and get 99% of Christians to become evangelists and the minority not evangelize. And actually we have the exact opposite in most churches, where very few people do the evangelism and large numbers of people literally don't do any kind of evangelism at all, for many various reasons. The disadvantages of this model is it's developed by theorists and not practical. If you talk to me as a church planter and evangelist on the ground, this kind of model does not work well. It breaks down. Why? Because of people. It breaks down because of people. Additionally, sounds good, just doesn't work. So when you hear somebody promoting the Amway model, trust me, it doesn't work. I've been around many models like this before, been around many people trying to promote models like this, and it just doesn't work. So thank you for being a part of this lesson, and I'm going to continue with other lessons, and so you can continue to look at different videos about lessons dealing with church planting. Specifically, from my experience in Cambodia, in the Philippines, and other areas of Southeast Asia, but I believe many of these things that I've learned in this area can apply to you in your situation also.